The carriage stopped at the edge of the village, and Clara Whitmore did not step out right away. Her hands trembled on her lap, not from cold, but from memory. 10 years ago, she had run from this same road, chased by shame that was never hers to carry. Now she had come back, and the village looked smaller than she remembered, as if it had shrunk while she grew. Through the small window, she could see the familiar shapes of the cottages, their roofs patched with the same thatch, the same smoke curling from the same chimneys. The bakery still stood on the corner, its sign creaking gently in the wind, and the smell of fresh bread drifted faintly through the cracked carriage window, pulling her back to mornings she thought she had buried for good. She pressed a hand to her chest, willing her heart to slow, willing herself to remember why she had come, and why turning back was no longer an option. She thought of her mother, gone now for 3 winters, and of the promise she had once whispered over her grave, a promise to return only when she was strong enough to face this place without flinching. That day had finally arrived, though her hand still shook slightly as she reached for the carriage door. A boy ran past the carriage window, chasing a hoop with a stick, laughing without a care. Clara watched him and thought of how she had once laughed like that too, before everything changed. Before the night the Duke's men dragged her from her mother's cottage and told her she was never to set foot in Ashfield again. She had believed, foolishly, that she would never return, but life has a strange way of circling back to unfinished business, and Clara's business here was far from finished. The carriage door opened, and Eliza Combe, the village innkeeper, stood frozen on the path outside her inn, a basket of bread nearly slipping from her arms. She stared at Clara, as if seeing a ghost risen from a grave that was never properly dug. "Clara?" Eliza whispered, her voice catching. "Clara Whitmore, is that truly you?" Clara stepped down from the carriage, smoothing her traveling coat, her chin lifted in a way it had never been lifted a decade ago. "It is me, Eliza. I have come home." Eliza's eyes darted nervously toward the great house on the hill, where the Duke's flag still fluttered above the stone towers. "You cannot be here. You know what he said. He swore that if you ever returned—" "I know what he swore," Clara interrupted gently. "I was there when he said it." Word spreads fast in a small village, faster than any carriage or horse. Within the hour, half of Ashfield had gathered near the market square, whispering behind their hands, watching the strange woman in fine traveling clothes who dared to walk the same streets she had once been forced to flee. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Old men lowered their pipes and stared. Even the blacksmith stepped away from his forge, wiping soot from his hands, drawn by the strange electricity that had settled over the square like weather rolling in from the sea. Clara felt every gaze upon her, but she did not lower her eyes. She had spent 10 years learning how to stand still under the weight of judgment, and she was not about to forget that lesson now, not when it mattered most. Among them stood Vincent Hale, the Duke's steward, a tall man with tired eyes and a stiff collar that always seemed a size too small. He had served the Duke faithfully for 15 years, managing the estate's affairs with quiet efficiency. But even loyal men remember things they wish they could forget, and Vincent remembered the night Clara Whitmore was cast out better than anyone alive, save the Duke himself. He watched from a distance as Clara walked through the square, her head held high despite the stares. He noticed something else too, something that made his stomach twist with unease. Clara was not alone. Behind her walked a young man, perhaps 20 years of age, with sharp eyes and a quiet, watchful manner. He carried himself with the same stillness Clara did, as though he too understood what it meant to be judged before being known. Vincent did not recognize the young man's face, but something about the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, struck a chord of memory so deep and so troubling that Vincent had to steady himself against a fence post. He turned quickly and hurried up the hill toward the great house. The Duke needed to know, and he needed to know now. Inside the manor, Duke Edmund Ashworth sat in his study, reviewing accounts with the practiced boredom of a man who had done the same task 1,000 times before. He was not an old man, though the lines around his eyes suggested a life weighted with more worry than most men his age carried. His wife, Lady Margaret, sat nearby, embroidering by the window, humming softly to herself, unaware that the peace of her afternoon was about to shatter. Vincent burst into the study without knocking, a breach of etiquette so unusual that Edmund set down his pen at once. "Your Grace," Vincent said, breathless, "you must come to the square. She has returned." Edmund's face went pale, though he tried, out of long habit, to keep his composure. "Who has returned, Vincent? Speak plainly." "Clara Whitmore." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret looked up from her embroidery, confused by the sudden tension, sensing something in her husband's expression she had never seen before, not once in 12 years of marriage. Fear. That is not possible, Edmund said, his voice low. I gave clear instructions. She was never to return to Ashfield. She has returned, Your Grace, Vincent said. And she is not alone. Edmund rose from his chair so quickly it scraped loudly against the floor. Who is with her? Vincent hesitated, choosing his words carefully. A young man. I did not recognize him, but Your Grace, there is something about him. Something in his face. Edmund's hands curled into fists at his sides. He did not need to ask more. A cold dread settled over him, the kind of dread that only comes from secrets buried but never truly gone. Prepare the carriage, Edmund said. I will see for myself. Margaret rose too, setting her embroidery aside. Edmund, what is happening? Who is this woman? No one of importance, Edmund said, too quickly, too sharply. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, the first small crack in a marriage built on trust that had never once been tested until this very moment. Down in the village square, Clara stood near the old stone well, the same well where she used to fetch water as a girl, back when her hands were rougher and her dreams smaller. The young man beside her placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Are you certain you wish to do this here, in front of everyone? He asked quietly. We could wait. Choose a quieter moment. Clara shook her head. No, Nathaniel. I have waited 10 years for a quiet moment that never came. I will not wait any longer. Nathaniel nodded, though his eyes remained watchful, scanning the crowd, the road, the great house on the hill, as though preparing for a storm he already knew was coming. The villagers whispered among themselves, some remembering Clara fondly, others regarding her with suspicion, the way people often regard anyone who dares to disturb a peace that was never truly peaceful, only quiet. An old woman named Mrs. Prescott, who had known Clara's mother years ago, stepped forward from the crowd. Clara, child, is it truly you? We heard you had died, out there, wherever they sent you. I did not die, Clara said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest, though there were nights I wished I had. Mrs. Prescott's eyes filled with tears. What happened to you, child? Why did the Duke send you away so suddenly, without a word of explanation to any of us? Clara opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the sound of carriage wheels echoed down the hill road, fast and urgent. The crowd turned as one, watching the Duke's carriage race toward the square, dust rising behind its wheels like a warning. Clara did not move. She stood perfectly still, her hand finding Nathaniel's arm, steadying herself for what was about to come. The carriage stopped hard, and Duke Edmund stepped out before it had fully halted, his face a mask of forced calm that fooled no one who looked closely enough. His eyes swept across the crowd until they found her, and for a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself, 10 years collapsing into a single breath. Clara, he said, his voice tight, you were told never to return. I was told many things, Your Grace, Clara replied, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Not all of them were true. The crowd murmured, sensing the weight of a conversation happening beneath the surface of the words, something old and unresolved bubbling up after years of silence. Edmund's gaze shifted to Nathaniel, and it was then that something changed in his face, something the entire village noticed, even if they did not yet understand its meaning. The Duke, a man known for his iron composure, looked, for just a moment, afraid. Who is this? Edmund demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. Nathaniel stepped forward slightly, meeting the Duke's eyes without flinching. My name is Nathaniel, Your Grace. I believe you already know why I am here. Edmund said nothing. He simply stared, his jaw tight, his hands trembling ever so slightly at his sides, a tremor so small that only Vincent, standing close behind him, noticed it at all. Margaret arrived moments later, having followed on foot, her breath short from hurrying down the hill. She stopped beside her husband, looking between Clara, Nathaniel, and Edmund's stricken face, trying to piece together a puzzle whose shape she could not yet see. Edmund, she said softly, please, tell me what is happening. But Edmund did not answer his wife. His eyes remained locked on Nathaniel, on the young man's face, searching it for something he clearly both dreaded and needed to confirm. Clara watched the Duke's reaction with a quiet, aching satisfaction. For 10 years she had imagined this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times during cold nights and uncertain days, but now that it had finally arrived, she felt only a strange, heavy stillness, the calm of a storm that has waited a decade to finally break. You cast me out to protect your secret, Clara said, her voice carrying to every corner of the square. But secrets do not stay buried forever, Your Grace. Some of them grow up, some of them learn to walk, and some of them come home. The villagers fell utterly silent, every eye fixed on the Duke, waiting to see what he would say, waiting to understand what none of them yet fully grasped, but all of them could feel in the air like the charge before lightning strikes. Edmund opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Ashfield had nothing to say. Silence stretched across the square, thick enough to feel against the skin. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood frozen beside his carriage, his eyes fixed on the young man standing next to Clara Whitmore, and the entire village watched him struggle to find words that would not come. Margaret stepped closer to her husband, her voice low but firm. "Edmund, you will tell me what is happening, and you will tell me now. Who is this woman? Who is this young man?" Edmund swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Margaret, please. Not here. Not like this." "Then when, Edmund?" Margaret's voice cracked slightly, though she fought to keep it steady in front of the watching crowd. "When would have been a better time for me to learn that my husband has secrets buried deep enough to make him tremble in front of half the village?" Clara watched the exchange with a strange mixture of pity and resolve. She had not come to hurt Margaret. She had come for answers, for justice long overdue, but she had never wished to drag an innocent woman into the wreckage of the Duke's choices. "Lady Margaret," Clara said gently, stepping forward, "I do not wish to cause you pain, but the truth has waited far too long, and I will not carry it silently any longer." Margaret turned to face her fully now, studying Clara's face, as though searching for something familiar in it. "Who are you to my husband?" "I was a girl from this village," Clara said. "A girl your husband cast out 10 years ago, in the middle of the night, without explanation, without mercy, and without a single word to anyone about why." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Prescott, who had known Clara's mother, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Eliza Combe, standing near her inn, felt her heart pound with the memory of that terrible night, a night she had never spoken of to anyone, not even her own husband. A younger woman near the back of the crowd, a weaver named Charlotte, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered that she had always found it strange how quickly Clara's family had stopped speaking of her, as though an unspoken rule had settled over the entire village, forbidding anyone from asking too many questions. Now, standing in the square, watching the Duke's face crumble, Charlotte understood at last why that silence had felt so heavy for so many years. Edmund's voice finally found its strength again, though it shook with barely controlled emotion. "Clara, this is not the place. Come to the manor. We will discuss this privately, as we should have discussed it years ago." "No," Clara said, and the single word rang out clear and unshaken. "I discussed things privately once before, Your Grace, and you had me dragged from my home in the dark, with no chance to say goodbye to anyone I loved. I will not make that mistake again. Whatever must be said, it will be said here, in front of the people who deserve to know the truth about the man who rules over them." Nathaniel stood quietly beside her, his eyes never leaving Edmund's face, watching the Duke's composure crumble piece by piece with every word Clara spoke. Vincent Hale, standing near the carriage, felt his own chest tighten with dread. He had served Edmund faithfully for 15 years, had believed, or told himself he believed, that his master was a fair and honorable man. But the fear on Edmund's face now told a different story, one Vincent feared he already partly understood. "Your Grace," Vincent said quietly, stepping closer. "Perhaps it would be wise to hear her out. The longer this stretches, the more the village will wonder, and wondering breeds far worse stories than the truth ever could." Edmund shot his steward a sharp look, but there was no real anger in it, only exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 10 years running from something that had finally caught up to him. "Fine," Edmund said at last, his shoulders sinking slightly. "Say what you have come to say, Clara." Clara took a breath, steadying herself. 10 years of rehearsed words rose to her lips, but now that the moment had come, she found herself speaking not from memory, but from the raw truth still living in her heart. 10 years ago, I worked in this village as a seamstress, mending clothes for families who could not afford a tailor. I was young, and I was poor, but I was happy. I had my mother, I had my friends, and I had dreams of a small, simple life here in Ashfield. Clara's voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. I remember the smell of the fabric shop where I worked, the sound of the church bell each evening, the faces of neighbors who greeted me by name every morning without fail. It was not a grand life, but it was mine, and I loved it fiercely. Then one night, men arrived at my mother's cottage, men wearing the Duke's colors. They told me I had 1 hour to gather my belongings before I was taken from the village and left on the road, forbidden to ever return. My mother wept and begged them to explain themselves, but they gave no answer, only orders. I was permitted no farewell to my friends, no chance to explain my absence, nothing but a cart, a driver who would not meet my eyes, and a long road stretching into darkness. Why? Someone called from the crowd, an old farmer named Edwin, who had known Clara since she was a child. Why would the Duke do such a thing to a village girl who harmed no one? Clara looked directly at Edmund as she answered, because I knew something the Duke could not allow to become known, something about his past, before he inherited this title, before he became the man standing before you today. Edmund's face had gone pale as parchment. Clara, do not do this. I am not doing anything, Your Grace, except telling the truth, Clara said. Something you should have done 10 years ago, instead of hiding behind threats and silence. Margaret's hands trembled at her sides. Edmund, what is she talking about? What could you possibly have to hide from a seamstress? Clara turned to Nathaniel, and something passed between them, an understanding built over years of shared purpose. This is Nathaniel, Clara said to the crowd. He is the son of a woman named Rosalind, a woman who once worked in this very manor, many years before I was born. The name struck Edmund like a physical blow. His knees seemed to weaken, and Vincent instinctively reached out to steady him, though Edmund shook off the assistance, forcing himself to stand tall despite the storm raging behind his eyes. Rosalind, Edmund whispered, the name barely audible. You knew Rosalind? I did not know her, Clara said. But I knew her son, and when I discovered the truth of his birth, and the truth of what happened to his mother, I made the mistake of asking questions in this very village. Questions that reached the wrong ears far too quickly. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. My mother worked here as a maid, Your Grace, many years ago. She was young, and she trusted the wrong man. When she found herself carrying a child, she was sent away in shame, told never to speak of who the father was, threatened with ruin if she ever dared. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. She never told me stories of the manor, of the grand halls or the fine gardens. She told me only of hard winters, of long hours spent washing linens in other people's houses, of the ache in her hands and the ache in her heart that never fully healed. I grew up believing my father had simply abandoned us out of indifference. I did not know, until her final days, that he had never even known I existed until it was far too late for him to make a different choice. The crowd erupted into murmurs, the pieces of a decade-old mystery finally beginning to fall into place before their very eyes. Margaret stood utterly still, her face draining of color as the truth crept toward her like a shadow lengthening at dusk. Edmund, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, tell me this is not true. Tell me you did not father a child before our marriage, and then send away not one, but two innocent people to protect your own reputation. Edmund could not meet his wife's eyes. He stared instead at the ground, at his own polished boots, as though the earth itself might open and swallow him whole, and spare him from the shame closing in around him. Margaret, he finally said, his voice broken. I was young. I made mistakes. I never meant for anyone to be hurt. You never meant? Clara's voice rose, sharp as a blade. You sent a woman away with child, and years later, when I stumbled upon the truth while helping a young man search for his family, you cast me out too, simply for knowing what you wished to keep buried. You did not merely make a mistake, Your Grace. You destroyed lives to protect your comfort. The square had gone utterly silent now, save for the soft weeping of Mrs. Prescott, who remembered all too well the night Clara vanished from the village, and had spent years wondering what had truly happened to the girl she had watched grow up. Vincent Hale stood frozen, his loyalty to the Duke crumbling beneath the weight of a truth he had never known, though perhaps, some quiet part of him admitted, he had always suspected something dark lived beneath his master's polished exterior. Where is Rosalind now? Margaret asked quietly, turning to Nathaniel. Your mother, is she still alive? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of grief crossed his composed features. She passed 3 years ago. She spent her final years in a small town far from here, working herself to exhaustion to raise me alone, never once speaking ill of the man who abandoned her, though she never spoke his name either, not until the very end. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. I remember the winter she grew too weak to work, how the neighbors brought us what little food they could spare, how she still insisted on mending clothes by candlelight, even when her hands trembled too badly to hold the needle steady. She never complained, not once, though I could see the weight of the years pressing down on her more heavily each season. When she finally told me the truth of my birth, it was less a confession than a release, as though she had been carrying a stone in her chest for 2 decades, and could finally set it down. Clara reached out and placed a steadying hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, and the gesture spoke of a bond forged through shared hardship and shared purpose, a friendship built on the wreckage the Duke had left behind. When Rosalind was dying, Clara continued, she gave Nathaniel a letter, sealed and hidden for over 20 years. A letter meant for the man who fathered him, should he ever wish to know the truth. Nathaniel came to find that man, and I offered to help him, because I understood better than most what it meant to be silenced by someone with more power than conscience. Edmund's hands shook visibly now, and he finally looked up, meeting Nathaniel's eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation had begun. In that gaze, something shifted, recognition perhaps, or the beginning of an emotion Edmund had spent 20 years refusing to feel. "Do you have it?" Edmund asked quietly. "The letter?" Nathaniel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded, yellowed piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from years of careful handling. "I do," he said, "but I did not come here merely to deliver a letter, Your Grace. I came to see the truth spoken aloud, in front of the people who have lived under your rule, believing you to be a man of honor." The crowd waited, breathless, as Edmund stared at the letter in Nathaniel's hand. A piece of his past finally arrived to collect the debt he had spent 2 decades avoiding. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between her husband and the young man holding the letter, though her posture carried no hostility, only a desperate need to understand the shape of the life she had believed herself to be living. "May I see it?" she asked quietly. "The letter, I mean. If it concerns my husband, then it concerns me as well." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, weighing the request, before glancing at Clara for guidance. Clara gave a small nod, and Nathaniel extended the folded paper toward Margaret, though Edmund's hand shot out first, trembling as he intercepted it before his wife could take hold. "Not here," Edmund said, his voice hoarse. "Please, Margaret, not in front of the entire village." "You have already lost the right to decide what happens in front of the village, Edmund," Margaret replied, her voice steady now, hardened by the shock settling into something firmer. "You made that choice the night you sent an innocent girl away to protect yourself. Give Nathaniel back his letter." Reluctantly, painfully, Edmund released his grip, and the letter passed from his trembling fingers into Nathaniel's steady ones. Vincent Hale watched the entire exchange with a heavy heart, understanding now that whatever loyalty he had once felt toward his master would never again feel simple or unquestioned. The wind picked up across the square, rustling the edges of market stalls and stirring dust along the cobblestones, as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to learn whether the Duke of Ashfield would finally answer for the truth he had buried for 20 long years. Somewhere near the front of the crowd, a young mother lifted her small daughter onto her hip, whispering that she should remember this day, that she was witnessing something rare and important, a powerful man finally made to answer for choices he had once believed no one would ever question. The letter sat in Nathaniel's hand, unopened, its yellowed edges trembling slightly in the afternoon wind. The entire square held its breath, waiting to see what the Duke would do next, waiting to learn whether the man who had ruled Ashfield with an iron grip for 20 years would finally crack beneath the weight of his own past. Edmund's eyes remained fixed on the paper, and for a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as though the village itself had turned to stone under the strange spell of the confrontation unfolding in its heart. "Open it," Edmund finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If you have carried it this far, Nathaniel, then finish what you came to do." Nathaniel glanced at Clara once more, and she gave him a small, steady nod, the kind of nod that had carried them both through countless difficult moments over the past several months of searching, questioning, and waiting for this very day to arrive. Slowly, carefully, Nathaniel unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly, worn thin from years of being read and reread by a dying woman who had wanted her son to understand the truth before she left this world. A hush fell so complete that even the birds in the nearby elm trees seemed to quiet their singing. Mrs. Prescott clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting between Clara, Nathaniel, and the Duke, as though trying to memorize every detail of a moment she knew the village would speak of for years to come. Eliza Combe had abandoned her breadbasket entirely, setting it down upon a nearby cart without a second thought, her full attention fixed on the unfolding drama before her. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "To whoever holds this letter, if my son has found his way to you, then I am gone, and I trust him to carry my truth with honesty and courage, qualities I tried my best to instill in him, despite the hardships life placed upon us both." Nathaniel paused, steadying his breath before continuing. "Edmund, if you are reading this, know that I never hated you, though I had every reason to. You were young, as was I, and perhaps neither of us understood the weight of what passed between us that spring. But when I came to you, frightened and alone, carrying news that would change both our lives forever, you turned me away without a second thought, more concerned with your reputation and your approaching marriage than with the child growing inside me. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall in front of the crowd. Edmund stood motionless, his face pale as the letters aged paper, unable to look away from his wife's stricken expression. Nathaniel continued reading, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building within him. I do not write this to cause you pain, Edmund, though perhaps pain is exactly what you deserve after all these years of silence. I write this because our son deserves to know where he comes from, and because I am tired, so very tired, of carrying a secret that was never mine alone to bear. Our son's name is Nathaniel. He has your eyes, though I pray he never inherits your capacity for cowardice. Raise him well, if you are able, or at the very least, do not stand in his way should he ever wish to know the truth of his birth. The letter ended there, the final line slightly smudged, as though tears had fallen upon the page long before Nathaniel had ever held it in his own hands. Silence blanketed the square. Even the wind seemed to still, as though nature itself understood the gravity of what had just been spoken aloud for the entire village to hear. Edmund finally broke the silence, his voice raw with an emotion he had spent 2 decades suppressing. I was a coward, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him something physical, some deep and painful surrender of the pride he had worn like armor for so long. Rosalind came to me, frightened and alone, and I sent her away, because I feared what my father would say, what society would say, what it would mean for the marriage that had already been arranged for me since childhood. Margaret stared at her husband, her expression a complicated mixture of heartbreak and fury, and when Clara discovered the truth, years later, you sent her away too, simply to protect a secret you should have confessed the moment I agreed to marry you. Yes, Edmund admitted, his voice breaking. I was afraid, Margaret, afraid of losing you, afraid of losing everything I had built, afraid of the shame that would follow me if the truth ever came to light. I told myself that sending Clara away was a small mercy, that it was better than the alternative, though I never truly examined what that alternative might have been. He pressed a hand to his temple, as though trying to steady thoughts that had scattered wildly the moment Nathaniel's letter had been read aloud. My father was a hard man, Margaret. You never knew him, for he passed before we married, but he ruled this estate with an unforgiving hand, and he raised me to believe that reputation mattered more than kindness, that duty to the family name outweighed duty to any single person's well-being. When Rosalind came to me, frightened and uncertain, I heard my father's voice in my head before I heard my own conscience, and I chose the path he would have chosen. I have regretted it every single day since, though regret alone changes nothing. Margaret's jaw tightened. Regret is easy, Edmund. Action is what matters. And for 10 years you took none, until the truth arrived uninvited on your very doorstep and forced your hand. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many villagers exchanging glances, some remembering old Duke Ashworth's reputation for strictness, a reputation that had apparently cast a longer shadow over his son's choices than anyone in the village had ever realized. A small mercy? Clara's voice cut through the square, sharp with a decade of buried anger finally given permission to surface. You call it mercy, casting a young woman out into the world with no warning, no money beyond what fit in a single bag, no chance to say farewell to the mother who raised her alone? I spent years wondering what had become of my life, Your Grace, years rebuilding myself from nothing because you could not bear the thought of your secret reaching your betrothed's ears. Edmund's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of her words, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked less like a proud duke and more like a man crushed by the consequences of choices made long ago, in fear and youth and selfishness. Vincent Hale stepped forward hesitantly, clearing his throat. Your Grace, if I may, the village deserves to understand what happens now. They have heard the truth. They will not simply forget it and return to their homes as though nothing has changed. Edmund looked at his steward, then out at the sea of faces watching him, villagers he had governed for years, some with fondness, others with the quiet resentment that often simmers beneath the surface of unequal power. He saw fear in some eyes, judgment in others, and in a few, a flicker of something that looked almost like sympathy, though he knew he had done little to earn it. What do you want from me, Clara? Edmund asked finally, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier authority. You have exposed my past in front of the entire village. What is it you seek? Money? Revenge? My title? Clara shook her head slowly. I do not want your money, Your Grace, and I certainly do not want your title. I want the truth spoken plainly, without hiding, without threats, without another decade of silence swallowing another innocent life. I want Nathaniel to be acknowledged as your son, publicly, so that no one in this village or beyond it can ever again pretend Rosalind's suffering did not happen. Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. I did not come here for wealth or title either, Your Grace. I came because my mother spent her final years wondering if the truth would ever matter to anyone beyond herself. I came to give her that answer, even if it arrives after she is no longer here to hear it. Margaret turned to face Nathaniel directly, studying his features with fresh eyes, searching for traces of her husband in the young man's face, in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, features she now recognized with painful clarity. You have his eyes, she said softly, echoing Rosalind's words from the letter without realizing it. I am sorry, Nathaniel, for whatever role my presence in Edmund's life played in your mother's suffering, even if I knew nothing of it until this very moment. You have nothing to apologize for, my lady, Nathaniel said gently. You were as much a stranger to this secret as the rest of the village. The fault lies with the man who chose silence over honesty, not with the woman who trusted him enough to marry him. Edmund flinched at the words, though he did not argue against them. He knew, deep in the aching core of his conscience, that every accusation leveled against him carried the weight of undeniable truth. An elderly man near the front of the crowd, a retired blacksmith named Walter, cleared his throat loudly. Your Grace, if I may speak, we have followed your rule for many years, trusting that you governed this village with fairness and honor. Learning now that such deception lived beneath your authority, it shakes something in all of us. We deserve to know what you intend to do to make this right. Edmund looked around at the gathered villagers, at faces he had known his entire life, faces that now regarded him with a wariness he had never encountered before, not even in his most difficult years as Duke. I intend, Edmund said slowly, each word feeling as though it were being carved from stone, to acknowledge Nathaniel publicly as my son, to provide for him, as I should have done from the very beginning, and to offer Clara whatever restitution she deems fair for the suffering my cowardice caused her. Restitution will not undo 10 years of exile, Clara said quietly, but an honest acknowledgement, spoken here, in front of the people who once believed the worst of me, without knowing why I truly left, that would mean more than any amount of money you could offer. Edmund turned to face the crowd fully now, drawing a long, unsteady breath. Then let it be known, here and now, before every soul gathered in this square, that Nathaniel is my son, born of Rosalind, a woman I wronged through cowardice and fear. Let it be known that Clara Whitmore was cast out unjustly, punished for the crime of discovering a truth I lacked the courage to face myself. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, spoken at last after 2 decades of careful, deliberate silence. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of her husband's confession, before opening them again with a resolve that surprised even herself. This is not the end of this conversation, Edmund. There is much still to discuss, privately, between the two of us. But you were right to speak the truth publicly today. The village deserved that much, at the very least. Walter the blacksmith lingered a moment longer than the rest, studying Edmund's face with an expression that mixed disappointment with something almost like reluctant respect. It takes a certain kind of courage to admit fault in front of an entire village, Your Grace. Even if that courage arrived a decade later than it should have, I hope, for young Nathaniel's sake and for Clara's, that this is truly the beginning of change, and not merely a performance to quiet the crowd before winter sets in and memories grow convenient and short. Edmund met the old blacksmith's gaze steadily. You have every right to doubt me, Walter. I have given this village little reason for trust over the years, but I intend to prove, through actions rather than words alone, that today marks a genuine turning point. Walter nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded, and he turned to rejoin the dispersing crowd without further comment, leaving his words hanging heavy in the afternoon air. Vincent Hale, watching the entire scene unfold, felt a strange mixture of relief and unease settle over him. The truth had finally surfaced, but truth, he understood, was often only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult reckoning. He thought of the years he had spent managing the estate's ledgers, arranging quiet payments to a solicitor in a distant town, payments he had never fully understood the purpose of until this very afternoon. Pieces of a puzzle he had unknowingly helped assemble were now falling into place, and the picture forming made his stomach turn with quiet shame. He approached Edmund carefully as the Duke prepared to return to his carriage. Your Grace, there is something you should know. The quarterly payments to the solicitor in Marlow, the ones you instructed me never to record in the main ledger. I always assumed they were a private matter, unrelated to estate business. Were they connected to this? Edmund's expression tightened. Not now, Vincent. We will speak of this at the manor. But Clara, standing close enough to overhear, felt a fresh wave of suspicion rise within her. Quiet payments, hidden ledgers, a solicitor in a distant town. These were not the marks of a man who had simply made peace with his past. These were the marks of a man still working, even now, to control a story he could no longer fully contain. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves, processing the revelations that had just reshaped their understanding of the man who governed their lives, Clara stood quietly beside Nathaniel, watching the Duke retreat toward his carriage, his shoulders bowed under a burden he could no longer deny or hide. "It is not over," Nathaniel said quietly to Clara, as the villagers dispersed around them. "He spoke the truth today, but men like him rarely change so easily. We must remain watchful." Clara nodded, her eyes still fixed on the retreating figure of the Duke. "I know, but today, at least, the silence is finally broken. Whatever comes next, we face it together, as we always have." Eliza Combe approached them cautiously, her earlier shock giving way to something warmer, more welcoming. "Clara, whatever the coming days bring, you and your companion are welcome to stay at my inn for as long as you need. It is the very least I can offer. After all these years of silence I kept out of fear rather than loyalty." Clara offered her a grateful smile, the first true smile the village had seen from her since her arrival. "Thank you, Eliza. That means more to me than you know." As evening began to settle over Ashfield, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose, Clara and Nathaniel walked together toward the inn, the weight of the day's revelations settling heavily upon their shoulders, yet mixed with a fragile sense of relief neither had expected to feel so soon. "Do you think he meant what he said?" Nathaniel asked quietly, glancing back toward the manor on the hill, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight against the darkening sky. "About acknowledging me? About making things right?" Clara considered the question carefully before answering. "I think he meant it in the moment, standing before the entire village with nowhere left to hide. Whether that meaning survives the quiet of his own study, away from watching eyes, remains to be seen. Men like the Duke often find courage easier to summon in public than in private." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Then we will simply have to make certain he remembers his words, whether he wishes to or not." Clara reached out and squeezed his arm gently. "We will, Nathaniel. Together, exactly as your mother would have wanted." Behind them, the great house on the hill stood silhouetted against the fading light, its windows like watchful eyes, and somewhere within its walls, Duke Edmund Ashworth sat alone in his study, staring at the folded letter now resting upon his desk, wondering how many more secrets remained buried beneath the foundations of the life he had so carefully built. The morning after the confrontation in the square, Ashfield woke to a different kind of silence, not the comfortable quiet of routine, but the tense stillness of a village holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the manor, Edmund sat alone in his study long before the sun had fully risen, the letter from Rosalind still resting on his desk beside a stack of ledgers he had not touched in years. Vincent Hale knocked softly on the door, entering when bid, his expression carrying the same unease that had followed him since the previous afternoon. Vincent had spent the night pacing his small quarters above the stables, turning over years of small inconsistencies in his mind, moments he had dismissed at the time but which now, in light of yesterday's revelations, seemed to form a troubling pattern he could no longer ignore. "Your Grace," Vincent said carefully. "I did not sleep last night. I kept thinking of the payments to the solicitor in Marlow. You told me years ago they were private matters, unrelated to the estate. But given everything revealed yesterday, I find myself needing to ask directly, what were those payments truly for?" Edmund set down his pen, rubbing his tired eyes before answering. "They were meant to ensure Rosalind's silence, Vincent, and later, to ensure Clara's. I paid the solicitor to monitor them, to make certain neither ever returned to Ashfield, and to intervene quietly should either ever attempt to speak of what they knew." Vincent's stomach turned. "You had them watched? For 10 years?" "Yes," Edmund admitted, shame coloring his voice. "I told myself it was merely caution, a way to protect my family from scandal. But hearing it spoken aloud now, I understand how it truly sounds. It sounds like the actions of a man who never intended to make peace with his past, only to control it." Vincent stood silently for a long moment, processing the weight of what his master had just confessed. "And now, Your Grace? Now that the truth has already surfaced despite your efforts?" What do you intend to do with the solicitor's services? Edmund's jaw tightened. I intend to end the arrangement entirely. There is no more need for it, and frankly, no more excuse for it either. But even as he spoke the words, something in his expression gave Vincent pause, a flicker of hesitation that suggested the Duke's resolve might not be as firm as his declaration implied. Meanwhile, at Eliza Combs' inn, Clara woke early, her mind still turning over the events of the previous day. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found Nathaniel already awake, sitting near the window, watching the village slowly come to life outside. You did not sleep either, Clara observed, taking a seat across from him. How could I? Nathaniel replied. Yesterday I finally met the man responsible for my mother's suffering, and he acknowledged me in front of an entire village. It does not feel real, even now in the light of morning. Clara studied his tired face, noting the way his hands wrapped tightly around his cup of warm milk, as though holding on to something solid in a world that had shifted beneath him overnight. It will take time to feel real, Nathaniel. You have carried this search for so long, and now that the answer has finally arrived, it is natural to feel unmoored rather than triumphant. I felt the same way, in a smaller sense, the day I finally decided to return to Ashfield after years away. How did you find the courage? Nathaniel asked quietly, to come back to the place that hurt you so deeply? Clara considered the question for a long moment before answering. I am not certain courage is the right word. It felt less like bravery and more like necessity. I could not continue living with the truth buried, watching you carry your mother's pain without ever confronting the man responsible for it. Some debts, I have come to believe, must be collected in person, no matter how much easier it might be to simply walk away and let the past remain buried. Eliza appeared with a simple breakfast of bread and warm milk, setting it down before them with a kind smile. How are you both feeling after everything? Clara managed a small, tired smile, uncertain mostly, relieved that the truth is finally spoken, but uncertain what comes next. Eliza lingered a moment, wringing her hands slightly. I feel I owe you both an apology. Truthfully, I knew something was wrong the night you were sent away, Clara. I heard the commotion from my window, saw the Duke's men leading you toward the road. I told myself it was not my place to interfere, that speaking up would only bring trouble upon my own family. I have carried that guilt for 10 years. She set down a small jar of honey beside the bread, her hands still trembling slightly with the weight of the memory. My husband, rest his soul, told me that night to close the shutters and say nothing, that whatever business the Duke's men had was not ours to question. I have wondered many times over the years what might have happened had I found the courage to speak up then, rather than waiting a decade to finally say something. Clara reached across the table and took Eliza's hand gently. You were frightened, Eliza, as anyone in this village would have been. I do not blame you for staying silent. The blame belongs entirely to the man who created a world where silence felt safer than truth. Eliza's eyes glistened with unshed tears, grateful for the forgiveness she had not expected to receive so easily. Later that morning, a messenger arrived at the inn, delivering a formal letter bearing the Duke's seal, requesting Clara and Nathaniel's presence at the manor that afternoon. Clara studied the letter carefully, searching for any hint of threat hidden within its polite, formal wording, but found none, only a request phrased with unusual humility for a man of Edmund's station. Should we go? Nathaniel asked, watching her expression carefully. Yes, Clara said finally. If he intends to make things right, we should give him the chance to prove it, but we will remain cautious. Yesterday's confession was made in front of witnesses. Today, in the privacy of his study, we will see what kind of man he truly is. That afternoon, Clara and Nathaniel arrived at the manor, greeted at the door by Vincent, whose demeanor had shifted noticeably since the previous day. He led them through the grand halls, past portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down with painted, judgmental eyes, until they reached Edmund's study. The study smelled of old leather and pipe smoke, its shelves lined with thick ledgers and volumes of estate law that had clearly seen decades of use. Margaret was already present, seated near the window, her expression composed but distant, the look of a woman still processing a betrayal that had upended 12 years of assumed trust. She had chosen a plain gray dress that morning, unusual for her, as though even her wardrobe reflected the somber mood that had settled over the household since the previous day. Edmund rose as they entered, gesturing toward 2 empty chairs. Thank you for coming. I understand if you harbored doubts about my intentions. We did, Clara said plainly, taking her seat. We still do, somewhat. Words spoken in a public square are easily forgotten once the crowd disperses. I intend to prove otherwise, Edmund said, retrieving a folder from his desk and placing it before them. I have drafted documents formally acknowledging Nathaniel as my son, granting him a portion of the estate's income, and establishing a trust in his name that cannot be revoked or altered without his consent. Nathaniel studied the documents carefully, his expression guarded despite the generosity of the offer laid before him. This is more than I expected, Your Grace. Forgive me if I remain cautious about your sudden willingness to provide so much, so quickly. Your caution is fair, Edmund admitted. I have given you little reason to trust my intentions, but I have spent a sleepless night confronting the truth of what my cowardice cost your mother, cost Clara, and ultimately cost myself. I do not expect forgiveness, but I hope, in time, to earn at least a measure of your trust. He pushed the folder closer across the desk. I have also instructed my solicitor here in Ashfield to draft a formal letter of legitimacy, should you ever wish to claim the Ashworth name openly. I do not ask that you take it. I only wish for the choice to belong to you, rather than being decided for you as it once was decided for your mother. Margaret spoke for the first time since their arrival, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly simmering beneath the surface. I have asked my husband to also establish a formal apology to be read publicly, acknowledging Clara's wrongful exile, and offering her whatever compensation she believes fair for the years taken from her. Clara turned to Margaret, surprised by the unexpected support. Thank you, Lady Margaret. I did not expect an ally in you, given everything you have learned in the span of a single day. Margaret's expression softened slightly. I am angry with my husband, Clara, more angry than words can easily express. But my anger does not extend to you or to Nathaniel. You are both victims of choices made long before I ever became involved in this family's affairs. I intend to see that some measure of justice is done, regardless of how difficult the coming months prove for my marriage. As the discussion continued, Vincent stood quietly near the door, observing the strange, fragile negotiation unfolding before him. He found himself reflecting on his own role in the years of silence, the ledgers he had kept hidden, the payments he had processed without question. And he resolved quietly, in that moment, that he would no longer serve blindly, regardless of loyalty owed to the family that employed him. Just as the meeting seemed to reach a tentative, hopeful conclusion, a sharp knock interrupted the room. A young estate clerk entered, breathless, holding a folded note. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but a rider has just arrived from Marlow. He insists the message is urgent and must reach you immediately. Edmund took the note with a puzzled frown, unfolding it quickly. As his eyes scanned the words, his face drained of color once more, the fragile calm of the afternoon shattering in an instant. What is it, Edmund? Margaret asked, alarmed by her husband's sudden change in demeanor. Edmund lowered the note slowly, his hand trembling. The solicitor in Marlow. He claims that if I terminate our arrangement, as I informed him this morning I intended to do, he will release certain documents to the local papers, documents detailing far more than what has already come to light. Clara's eyes narrowed with fresh suspicion. What documents, Your Grace? What else have you been hiding? Edmund's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the fragile trust so carefully built over the course of the afternoon seemed to teeter dangerously on the edge of collapse. I do not know precisely what he means. I paid him only to ensure discretion regarding Rosalind and Clara. I never authorized him to gather further information beyond that. Vincent stepped forward, his expression grim. Your Grace, if I may, solicitors who handle discretion for powerful men rarely limit themselves to only the tasks assigned. Men like that often gather more than they are asked to gather, precisely so they retain leverage should their services ever be terminated. 2020. The room fell into tense silence, the hopeful resolution of moments earlier now clouded by the reappearance of a threat none of them had anticipated. Clara exchanged a wary glance with Nathaniel, both of them realizing simultaneously that the truth revealed in the village square the day before may have been only the surface of a much deeper, more dangerous secret still waiting to be uncovered. Margaret rose from her chair, crossing the room to stand beside her husband's desk, reading the note over his shoulder with growing alarm. Edmund, what could this solicitor possibly know that would be worse than what has already been revealed? You have already confessed to fathering Nathaniel outside our marriage, and to exiling Clara unjustly. What more could there be? Edmund shook his head slowly, genuine confusion mixing with dread across his features. I do not know, Margaret. I swear to you, I do not know. Clara studied the Duke carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, but found instead what appeared to be authentic fear. The fear of a man confronting a shadow even he could not fully name. Then perhaps, she said slowly, It is time we traveled to Marlow ourselves and ask the solicitor directly what he believes he holds over you." Nathaniel nodded in agreement. "If there are more secrets buried in this family's past, Your Grace, I would rather uncover them now, on our terms, than wait for them to surface as another ambush, sprung upon us when we least expect it." Edmund looked between Clara, Nathaniel, and his wife, and for the first time since the previous day's confession, something resembling genuine partnership passed between them. Four people bound together by circumstance, now facing an uncertain threat as a single, wary alliance rather than adversaries. "Very well," Edmund said finally, folding the note and placing it carefully inside his coat. "We leave for Marlow at first light tomorrow." The road to Marlow stretched long and winding, through hills still damp with morning mist, and the carriage carrying Edmund, Margaret, Clara, and Nathaniel rattled along in tense silence, each passenger lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them at the journey's end. Vincent Hale rode alongside on horseback, having insisted on accompanying the group despite Edmund's initial reluctance. "Your Grace, if this solicitor has information dangerous enough to warrant threats, you will want someone familiar with the estate's records present to verify whatever claims he makes." Edmund had relented, too exhausted from the previous day's revelations to argue further. Inside the carriage, Clara watched the countryside pass by the window, her mind turning over questions she could not yet answer. "Your Grace," she said finally, breaking the heavy silence, "tell me more about this solicitor. How did you come to hire him in the first place?" Edmund rubbed his temple wearily. "His name is Josiah Grant. My father used him for various discreet matters before his death, and I inherited the arrangement along with the title. When Rosalind came to me, frightened and desperate, I turned to Grant out of habit, trusting him because my father had trusted him before me. And you never questioned what else he might be gathering, beyond what you specifically requested?" Nathaniel asked. "I did not think to question it," Edmund admitted. "I was young, frightened, and grateful simply that the matter had been handled quietly. I did not consider that quiet handling might come with a price far greater than the fees I paid him." Margaret stared out the opposite window, her expression unreadable. She had said little since departing Ashfield, though the tension in her shoulders spoke volumes about the storm still raging beneath her composed exterior. Twice during the journey she opened her mouth as though to speak, and twice she closed it again, apparently deciding the words were not yet ready to be shared with the rest of the carriage's occupants. Clara found herself studying Margaret with a growing sense of quiet respect. Here was a woman who had every reason to retreat into anger, to abandon her husband entirely amid the wreckage of his confessions, yet she had chosen instead to remain, to seek truth alongside people who, only 2 days earlier, had been complete strangers to her. It was not forgiveness, Clara understood, but it was something adjacent to courage, and she found herself grateful for Margaret's steady, if wounded, presence. The carriage arrived in Marlow by early afternoon, a larger town than Ashfield, bustling with merchants, travelers, and the general noise of commerce that Clara had almost forgotten existed after years spent in quieter places. Josiah Grant's office stood on a narrow street near the town's central square, its windows dusty, its sign faded from years of weather. Grant himself greeted them at the door, a thin man with sharp features and eyes that missed little. He did not seem surprised by their arrival, as though he had anticipated this exact visit the moment he sent his warning note the previous day. "Your Grace," Grant said smoothly, gesturing them inside. "And company. How unexpected, though I confess, not entirely unwelcome. Please, come in." The office was cramped, lined with shelves of files and documents stacked in precarious towers that seemed to defy the very concept of organization. A single narrow window let in weak afternoon light, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily above stacks of paper that looked as though they had not been disturbed in years, save for the ones Grant clearly kept close at hand for matters of particular importance. The smell of old ink and older secrets seemed to cling to every surface of the room. Grant settled behind his desk, folding his hands and studying his visitors with the calm patience of a man who held considerable leverage and knew it well. He did not rise to greet them properly, nor did he offer refreshment, small discourtesies that Clara suspected were entirely deliberate, a subtle assertion of the power he believed he held over the Duke and his companions. "I assume you received my note," Grant said, addressing Edmund directly. "I trust it clarified my position on the matter of our arrangement's termination." "You threatened me," Edmund said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You threatened to release documents to the papers, unless I continued paying you, despite the fact that the very secrets you were meant to protect have already been revealed publicly." Grant's thin lips curved into something resembling a smile. Threatened is such an unpleasant word, Your Grace. I prefer to think of it as reminding you of the full scope of our arrangement, an arrangement that extended somewhat beyond the boundaries you originally specified. Clara leaned forward. What exactly did you gather, beyond monitoring Rosalind and myself? Grant's eyes shifted to her, assessing, calculating. And you must be the seamstress. Clara Whitmore, was it? I must say, you have proven far more resourceful than the Duke anticipated when he first hired me to ensure your silence. Answer her question, Nathaniel said sharply, his patience thinning. Grant leaned back in his chair, seemingly enjoying the discomfort radiating from his visitors. Very well. When the Duke first hired my services regarding Rosalind, I did what any thorough solicitor would do. I investigated thoroughly, to ensure I understood the full scope of what I was protecting. In doing so, I discovered something the Duke himself may not fully appreciate, something involving his father's own dealings, many years before Edmund inherited the title. Edmund's face paled. What are you talking about? My father died before any of this began. Indeed he did, Grant said. But your father, Your Grace, had his own secrets, secrets he entrusted to my predecessor, secrets that eventually passed into my keeping when I inherited this practice. It seems deception runs deeper in the Ashworth family line than a single generation's mistakes. The room fell silent, the weight of Grant's words settling over everyone present. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap, and even Clara, who had come seeking answers about her own exile, found herself unprepared for the direction the conversation had taken. What secrets? Edmund demanded, his voice rising. Tell me plainly, Grant. I have had enough of riddles and threats. Grant reached into a drawer and withdrew a thick folder, sliding it across the desk toward Edmund. Your father, the previous Duke, was not the honorable man history remembers him as. Decades ago, before you were born, he was involved in a scheme to seize land from village families under false claims of unpaid debts. Debts largely fabricated through falsified records. Several families lost their homes entirely, driven from Ashfield with nothing, while your father quietly absorbed their land into the estate's holdings. Edmund opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents within, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as the truth of his father's actions became undeniable, laid out in careful, damning detail. Names he recognized from childhood stared back at him from the aged pages, families who had once tended fields on the outskirts of Ashfield, families whose descendants still lived in the village, unaware that the very ground their ancestors had lost still generated income for the Ashworth estate to this very day. He recognized the name Fenwick among the documents, a family whose modest cottage now stood empty on the estate's northern border, its fields long since absorbed into the manor's holdings. He remembered vaguely, from childhood, being told the Fenwicks had abandoned their land voluntarily, unable to pay debts owed to the estate. Reading the falsified figures now before him, the manufactured records of debts that had never truly existed, Edmund understood for the first time that the story he had been told as a boy was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. This cannot be, Edmund whispered. My father was strict, yes, demanding, but this is theft. This is cruelty disguised as legal process. It is precisely that, Grant confirmed, and I have kept these records safe for over 2 decades, initially at your father's request, later maintaining the arrangement with you simply because it was profitable to do so. I never intended to release them, Your Grace. My threat yesterday was merely leverage, ensuring our financial arrangement continued. But now that you sit before me, perhaps it is time we discussed a new arrangement, one that benefits us both. Clara's eyes narrowed with disgust. You would continue extorting him, even now, knowing the harm his silence has already caused? Grant shrugged, unbothered by her judgment. I am a businessman, Miss Whitmore, not a moral philosopher. The Duke pays me, and I ensure certain inconvenient truths remain buried. It is a simple transaction, one that has served us both well for many years. Vincent, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward, his expression hardening with a resolve Clara had not seen in him before. Your Grace, I believe it is time this arrangement ended entirely, regardless of Mr. Grant's threats. The families who lost their land deserve to know the truth, just as Nathaniel and Clara deserve to know theirs. Edmund looked up from the damning folder, his eyes meeting Vincent's steady gaze. You would have me expose my own father's crimes, on top of everything already revealed? The scandal would be immeasurable, Vincent. It could destroy what remains of this family's standing entirely. Perhaps it should, Margaret said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering Grant's office. Edmund, I have spent the last day reckoning with the discovery that my marriage was built upon a foundation of hidden shame. I find I no longer have patience for further concealment, regardless of the cost to our family's reputation. If your father wronged innocent families, those families deserve restitution, just as Clara and Nathaniel deserve theirs. Edmund closed his eyes, the weight of 2 generations of buried wrongdoing pressing down upon him with crushing force. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, a hardening of resolve that had been absent since the confrontation began. "Grant," Edmund said, his voice steadier than it had been throughout the entire visit, "I will not pay you another shilling. Whatever consequences follow from releasing those documents, I will face them, publicly and honestly, rather than continue living under your leverage for another day." Grant's confident expression faltered slightly, clearly having not anticipated this particular response. "Your Grace, think carefully about what you are saying. The scandal from your father's crimes could ruin the family's standing for generations. Are you truly prepared to sacrifice everything for the sake of honesty?" "I have already sacrificed my own honor for the sake of comfort and silence," Edmund replied. "I will not compound that mistake by allowing my father's crimes to remain buried simply to protect a reputation that was never truly earned in the first place." He rose from his chair, drawing himself up with a dignity that had been notably absent throughout much of the visit. "You have profited from my family's fear for 2 decades, Mr. Grant. That profit ends today, regardless of whatever documents you believe still grant you power over me." Nathaniel watched the exchange with quiet approval, seeing in Edmund's newfound resolve something he had not expected to witness, a genuine shift from the fearful, cornered man who had stood in the village square days earlier. Clara stepped forward, addressing Grant directly. "You will return every document in your possession related to this family, and you will cease any further attempts at extortion, or we will ensure the entire town of Marlow learns of your own role in profiting from these hidden crimes for over 2 decades. Grant studied the 4 determined faces before him, calculating his options with the careful precision of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. He glanced briefly toward the door, as though considering whether some avenue of retreat remained available to him, before seeming to accept that none did. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, the confident mask slipping to reveal something closer to resignation. "You understand, of course, that I could simply refuse," Grant said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier bravado. "These documents are mine, kept under my own roof, gathered through my own diligence." "Gathered through opportunism, you mean?" Vincent countered sharply. "And kept, not out of diligence, but out of greed. You have profited from silence for over 2 decades, Mr. Grant. That chapter ends today." Grant's eyes flicked toward Edmund, searching for any sign of wavering resolve, any crack through which he might reassert his leverage. He found none. The Duke's expression had hardened into something resembling the quiet determination Clara had witnessed briefly in the village square, a man finally choosing to stand upright after years of bending beneath the weight of secrets. "Very well, I will provide the documents. But know this, Your Grace, once this truth becomes public, there will be no controlling how far the consequences reach." "I understand," Edmund said, "and I am prepared to face them, whatever they may be." As Grant began gathering the requested files, Vincent turned to Edmund quietly. "Your Grace, this is the right choice, though I imagine it will not feel like a victory for some time yet." "No," Edmund agreed, watching Grant work with a strange, hollow calm settling over him. "It will not feel like victory for a long while, but it will feel like the truth, finally, after decades of my family choosing convenient lies instead." Outside the solicitor's office, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the streets of Marlow, and Clara found herself standing beside Nathaniel once more, both of them absorbing the unexpected direction their search for truth had taken. "This is bigger than either of us imagined," Nathaniel said quietly. "Your exile, my birth, none of it was ever isolated. It was simply the latest chapter in a much longer pattern of silence and cruelty." Clara nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it is fitting that we are the ones to finally break that pattern, once and for all." Margaret joined them on the street a moment later, having stepped outside to gather her thoughts while Vincent finished arranging for the documents to be transported safely back to Ashfield. Her face bore the marks of exhaustion, but her eyes carried a new clarity that had not been present even the previous morning. "I have been thinking," Margaret said quietly, addressing both Clara and Nathaniel, "about the Fenwick family, and whoever else may have suffered under my husband's father. When we return to Ashfield, I intend to see that proper restitution reaches every family named in those documents, regardless of what it costs the estate financially." "That is a generous intention, my lady," Nathaniel said, though I imagine your husband may need convincing on the matter of cost. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin, determined line. My husband will find that I am considerably less forgiving of continued cowardice than I was of his initial confession. He chose honesty today, in this office, and I intend to hold him to that same standard going forward, whatever the expense. Edmund emerged from the solicitor's office a moment later, a heavy satchel of documents clutched in his hands, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and dread at the enormity of what still lay ahead. He looked at his wife, at Clara, at Nathaniel, and finally at Vincent, and something in their collective, unwavering expressions seemed to steady him, if only slightly. "It is done," Edmund said. "Grant has surrendered everything, and I have made it clear there will be no further payments. Whatever consequences arrive from this day forward, we will face them honestly, together." The five of them stood together on the narrow street of Marlow as the afternoon light softened toward evening, an unlikely alliance bound not by affection, but by a shared commitment to a truth too long buried. Ahead of them lay the long road back to Ashfield, and beyond that, a reckoning that would reshape the entire village's understanding of the family that had ruled over it for generations. The carriage returned to Ashfield as the sun dipped low over the hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, and the village that greeted them felt different somehow, though nothing about its cottages or streets had physically changed since their departure that morning. Perhaps it was simply that everyone inside the carriage had changed instead, carrying with them documents that would soon reshape the village's understanding of its own history. Edmund did not wait for morning to act. That very evening he summoned Vincent and instructed him to arrange a formal gathering in the village square for the following afternoon, inviting every family in Ashfield to attend, particularly those whose names appeared within the documents recovered from Marlow. Word spread quickly, as it always did in a village this size, and by the following afternoon, nearly the entire population of Ashfield had gathered once more in the square, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense that something significant was about to unfold. Farmers left their fields early, shopkeepers closed their doors for the afternoon, and even the school teacher dismissed her small class ahead of schedule, unable to keep the children's attention amid whispers that another great revelation awaited them in the square. The mood among the villagers was noticeably different from 2 days earlier, where shock and disbelief had dominated the first gathering. This crowd carried a cautious curiosity, tempered by the knowledge that whatever came next would likely reshape their understanding of Ashfield's history even further. Clara and Nathaniel stood near the front of the crowd, close to where Edmund would soon speak, while Margaret remained at his side, her presence a visible show of support despite the private struggles still unresolved between husband and wife. Vincent stood nearby, holding the satchel of documents that had traveled all the way from Marlow, ready to be presented as evidence of a truth long overdue. Edmund climbed the small platform normally used for market announcements, and the crowd fell silent, remembering all too well the last time he had stood before them with news that shook the foundations of everything they believed about their Duke. "Yesterday," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square, "I traveled to Marlow with my wife, with Clara Whitmore, and with my son Nathaniel, to confront a solicitor who had long profited from secrets my family worked hard to bury. What I discovered there extends far beyond my own personal failings. It reaches back to my father's time as Duke of this estate." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain and wary, as villagers exchanged glances, wondering what further revelations awaited them after the shock of previous days. "My father," Edmund continued, "orchestrated a scheme decades ago to seize land from several families in this village, using falsified debt records to justify claims that were never legitimate. Families lost their homes, their livelihoods, their generations of hard work, based on lies my father constructed to expand this estate's holdings." A gasp rose from somewhere near the back of the crowd, and an elderly woman pushed her way forward, her weathered face pale with shock. "Are you speaking of the Fenwicks, Your Grace? My grandmother spoke of them often, of the injustice done to that family, though she never had proof enough to make any formal complaint." Several other villagers nodded in recognition of the name, murmuring among themselves about half-remembered stories passed down through generations, tales of a family driven from their land under mysterious circumstances that no one had ever fully understood. A younger man near the front, introducing himself quietly as a distant cousin of the Fenwick line, stepped forward with tears gathering in his eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden, unexpected vindication of stories his family had carried as half-forgotten legend for decades. Edmund nodded gravely. "Yes, the Fenwicks, and several other families whose names appear in these documents." He gestured toward Vincent, who stepped forward with the satchel. prepared to distribute copies of the relevant records to anyone wishing to examine them. I intend to see every affected family properly compensated, with land returned where possible, and fair restitution offered where return is no longer feasible. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mixture of disbelief, cautious hope, and lingering anger at generations of hidden injustice finally brought into the light. Walter the blacksmith stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Your Grace, this is no small undertaking you propose. Returning land, offering restitution to multiple families. It will cost the estate dearly." "It will," Edmund agreed. "But the cost of continued silence has already proven far greater, in ways I am only now beginning to fully understand. I would rather face financial hardship honestly than continue prospering from wrongs my family committed against the very people I am meant to protect and serve." Clara watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, seeing in Edmund's public commitment a genuine shift from the fearful man who had once cast her out to silence and inconvenient truth. Beside her, Nathaniel remained watchful, still guarding a measure of caution despite the progress unfolding before them. An old man near the front, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, if I may ask, what of Clara Whitmore herself? You have spoken of restitution for the Fenwicks and others wronged by your father. But what of the woman standing beside your own son, wronged directly by your own hand?" Edmund turned to Clara, and for a moment, the entire square seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting to see how he would answer. "Clara," Edmund said, addressing her directly rather than the crowd, "I have thought carefully about what restitution could possibly repay 10 years taken from your life. Money alone feels insufficient, though I have set aside a considerable sum in your name, should you choose to accept it. But beyond money, I wish to offer something perhaps more meaningful." He paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing. "If you desire it, your family's old cottage, the one you were forced to leave that night, remains empty. It has stood vacant for years, maintained by the estate out of what I now recognize as guilt I could never quite name. A guilt I told myself for years was simple caretaking, though I understand now it was something closer to penance I was too afraid to acknowledge even to myself. It is yours, should you wish to reclaim it, along with the small parcel of land surrounding it, free of any claim or condition from the estate." Clara felt an unexpected wave of emotion rise within her, memories of her childhood home flooding back with sudden, overwhelming clarity. She had not expected such an offer, had not allowed herself to imagine returning to the physical space of her earlier life, only to the village itself. For a moment, she said nothing at all, simply standing before the gathered crowd, absorbing the strange, unexpected weight of a gift she had never dared to hope for during 10 long years away. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion she had not anticipated feeling. "I will consider your offer carefully." Margaret stepped forward then, addressing the crowd directly for the first time. "I wish to add that Nathaniel, as Edmund's acknowledged son, will receive proper education and standing befitting his birth, though he is, of course, free to choose whatever path in life he desires, whether that includes involvement in the estate's affairs or a life entirely separate from Ashfield." Nathaniel inclined his head respectfully toward Margaret. "Thank you, my lady. I have not yet decided what path suits me best, but I am grateful for the choice being offered, rather than a path forced upon me by circumstances beyond my control." As the formal announcements concluded, the crowd began to disperse into smaller clusters, discussing the day's revelations with the animated energy of people who had just witnessed history reshape itself before their very eyes. Villagers whose families appeared in the recovered documents approached Vincent eagerly, seeking copies of the records relevant to their own histories, while others simply lingered, absorbing the strange, transformative nature of the past several days. Eliza Combe approached Clara as the crowd thinned, her expression warm with genuine happiness. "Will you truly return to your family's cottage, Clara? After everything?" Clara considered the question seriously before answering. "I believe I will, Eliza. Not because the pain of what happened here has faded entirely, but because reclaiming that home feels like reclaiming a piece of myself the Duke's cruelty once tried to take away. I do not wish to let that cruelty win by keeping me from the place I truly belong." "And Nathaniel?" Eliza asked, glancing toward the young man standing nearby, deep in conversation with Vincent about the details of the estate's restitution plans. "Will he remain in Ashfield as well?" Clara smiled softly, watching Nathaniel's animated discussion. "I believe he will stay, at least for a while. He has spent his entire life searching for a place to belong, for a family willing to claim him openly. I think, for now, he has finally found both." As evening settled over the village once more, Clara made her way alone toward her family's old cottage, standing at the edge of the property where she had spent the first years of her life, before everything changed so suddenly and cruelly. The small stone building stood quiet in the fading light, its garden overgrown but not entirely lost, its windows dusty but intact. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, breathing in the musty air of a home long empty, yet somehow still carrying faint traces of memories she had thought lost forever. She could almost hear her mother's voice, humming softly while mending clothes by candlelight, could almost feel the warmth of a hearth that had once burned bright through cold winter nights. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs stretched between the ceiling beams, but beneath the neglect, Clara could still make out the small details that had once made this cottage a home. A faint scorch mark on the hearthstone from a long-ago cooking accident her mother had laughed about for years afterward. A notch carved into the doorframe, marking her height at various ages. The careful pencil lines still faintly visible beneath a layer of grime. Small, forgotten pieces of a life interrupted, waiting patiently to be remembered once more. Tears finally fell. Tears she had held back through days of confrontation, revelation, and careful negotiation. Tears born not of sorrow alone, but of a complicated, overwhelming relief that the long fight for truth had finally, truly ended. Nathaniel found her there some time later, standing quietly in the doorway, watching as she ran her fingers along the dusty mantelpiece where her mother had once kept a small collection of cherished trinkets, most of which had been lost or sold in the chaotic days following Clara's exile. "This is where you grew up," Nathaniel said softly, stepping inside to join her. "It is," Clara confirmed, wiping her eyes and offering him a tremulous smile. "It is smaller than I remembered, and far more worn. But it is still home. In a way nothing else has ever quite managed to be since I left." Nathaniel looked around the small, humble cottage, comparing it silently to the grand manor he had visited just days earlier, understanding now perhaps more fully than before the vast gulf between the world Clara had been forced to leave and the world into which he himself had unexpectedly been welcomed. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. "Now that the truth is finally out, now that the Duke has offered restitution, now that this cottage sits waiting for you to reclaim it." Clara considered the question for a long, thoughtful moment, gazing around the small room that held so many complicated memories, both cherished and painful. "I will rebuild," she said finally, slowly, carefully, the way anything worth having must be built. "I will repair this cottage, plant a garden where my mother's once grew, and try, in whatever way I can, to help this village heal from wounds it did not even know it carried, until just days ago." "And what of the Duke?" Nathaniel asked. "Do you believe he has truly changed, or will time reveal his confession as merely another convenient performance?" Clara considered the question carefully, thinking of Edmund's trembling hands as he read his father's damning documents, of the genuine fear and shame that had crossed his face throughout the ordeal in Marlow. "I believe he has begun to change," she said finally. "Whether that change proves lasting will depend on choices he makes in the quiet months ahead, far from the pressure of a watching crowd. But for now, I choose to believe in the possibility of genuine transformation, however cautiously." Outside the small cottage, the last light of evening faded into the soft darkness of night, and somewhere in the distance, the great house on the hill glowed warmly against the darkening sky, no longer a symbol of feared authority, but perhaps, slowly and imperfectly, beginning its transformation into something closer to honest stewardship. Clara stepped outside once more, standing in the overgrown garden of her childhood home, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling for the first time in 10 long years something she had almost forgotten how to recognize: peace. Nathaniel joined her in the garden, standing quietly beside her as the first stars began to appear overhead. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said softly, "for everything you have done, for the courage it took to return, to demand the truth, to help me find answers I feared I might never uncover." Clara reached out and squeezed his hand gently, grateful beyond words for the unlikely companion who had walked beside her through the most difficult and transformative days of her adult life. "And your mother would be proud of you too, Nathaniel, for carrying her truth with such quiet strength, for refusing to let her suffering remain buried and forgotten." Together they stood in the quiet garden as night fully settled over Ashfield, two people bound by circumstance and shared purpose, finally free from the shadows that had shaped so much of their separate, difficult journeys, ready now to build something new from the truth they had fought so hard to reclaim. In the days that followed, the village slowly began to heal. The Fenwick descendants received their long-overdue restitution, tears of relief mixing with decades of quiet resentment finally allowed to settle. Other families named in the recovered documents came forward as well, each receiving fair compensation from an estate now committed to honesty rather than concealment. Vincent Hale took on the careful work of overseeing these arrangements, finding in the task a renewed sense of purpose after years of unknowingly serving secrets he had never fully understood. Margaret and Edmund's marriage entered a long, difficult season of rebuilding, neither pretending the betrayal could be forgotten, both committing instead to the slower, harder work of earning back something resembling trust. It was not a resolution wrapped neatly in forgiveness, but rather an honest reckoning, the kind that takes years rather than days to fully settle. Some evenings Margaret still retreated to her private sitting room, unwilling to face her husband's company. Other evenings she sought him out deliberately, determined that whatever came next for their marriage would be decided through honest conversation rather than continued silence. Clara spent the following weeks restoring her family's cottage, clearing the overgrown garden, repairing the worn thatch roof, filling the small rooms once more with warmth and quiet purpose. Nathaniel remained in Ashfield, dividing his time between learning the responsibilities that came with his newly acknowledged place in the Ashworth family, and simply enjoying, for the first time in his life, the steady comfort of belonging somewhere fully and openly. And though the road that had brought them both to this quiet, healing village had been long and painful, neither Clara nor Nathaniel ever regretted the journey that led them home. A full year passed before Ashfield truly felt like a different village, though the change had been steady rather than sudden, built through months of small, deliberate choices rather than a single dramatic turn. Clara's cottage stood transformed, its garden blooming with vegetables and flowers she had planted with her own hands, its walls freshly whitewashed, its roof repaired against the coming winter. She had taken up her old trade once more, mending clothes for village families, though now she worked not out of desperate necessity, but from a genuine love of the craft her mother had once taught her, seated by the very same window where she had learned to thread a needle as a young girl. The village around her had changed as well, in ways both large and small. The old well in the square had been repaired, its stones reset by workers paid through the estate's restitution fund. A new footbridge crossed the stream near the mill, replacing one that had stood dangerously worn for years without repair. Small improvements, easily overlooked individually, but together they told the story of an estate finally investing in the people it governed, rather than simply extracting from them. On a bright autumn morning, Clara sat outside her cottage, sewing quietly, when she heard familiar footsteps approaching along the garden path. She looked up to see Nathaniel walking toward her, a satisfied smile on his face that had become far more common over the past year than the guarded caution he once carried. "You look pleased with yourself," Clara observed, setting aside her sewing as he approached. "I have reason to be," Nathaniel said, settling onto the small bench beside her. "The school Margaret and I proposed last spring finally opened its doors this morning. 12 children began their first lessons today, including 3 from families who could never have afforded proper schooling before the estate began funding it." Clara's face lit with genuine warmth. "That is wonderful news, Nathaniel. Your mother would be so proud, seeing the good that has grown from everything you endured to find your place here." Nathaniel's expression softened at the mention of his mother, though the grief no longer carried the same sharp edge it once had. "I think of her often, especially on days like this. I wish she could have lived to see how things turned out, to see that the truth, once spoken, could lead somewhere better than the silence she carried for so many years." Over the past year, Nathaniel had settled comfortably into his role within the Ashworth family, though he had firmly declined any formal title, choosing instead to focus his energy on practical improvements throughout the village. Alongside Margaret, he had championed the construction of a small schoolhouse, funded partly through the estate's income and partly through careful management of the restitution funds that remained after compensating the families wronged by the previous duke. He had also taken it upon himself to visit each family named in the recovered documents personally, listening to their stories, learning the specific ways his grandfather's crimes had shaped their lives across 2 generations. It was slow, often painful work, but Nathaniel approached it with the same quiet determination that had once carried him and Clara across the countryside in search of the truth. Edmund, for his part, had spent the year working quietly to rebuild trust, both within his marriage and throughout the village he governed. He no longer ruled from a distance, as his father had, but made regular visits throughout Ashfield, listening to concerns, addressing grievances, and slowly earning back a measure of the respect his family's hidden crimes had so thoroughly damaged. He had also begun keeping a private journal, a habit Margaret had suggested during one of their long conversations about honesty and accountability. In it, he recorded not only the practical business of the estate, but his own reflections on the choices that had brought him to this point, a discipline he hoped might prevent him from ever again choosing convenient silence over difficult truth. Margaret had emerged from the difficult year transformed in her own right, no longer the quiet, embroidering wife content to remain in the background of her husband's decisions. She had taken an active role in overseeing the restitution efforts, developing a genuine friendship with Clara along the way, two women bound together by an unlikely history that had somehow blossomed into mutual respect and understanding. She had also become something of an unofficial advocate for the village's women, quietly ensuring that widows and single mothers received fair treatment in matters of estate business that had once been handled exclusively through male relatives or overseers. It was work she had never imagined herself capable of before the events of the past year, work that had given her a renewed sense of purpose beyond the quiet domesticity she had once accepted as her only role. "Will you come to the schoolhouse dedication this evening?" Nathaniel asked, watching a group of children run past on the village lane, laughing freely in a way that felt like a small, quiet victory in itself. "Margaret has arranged a modest celebration, nothing grand, simply the village coming together to mark the occasion." "Of course I will come," Clara said. "I would not miss it." That evening, the village gathered near the newly built schoolhouse, its fresh timber still carrying the faint scent of sawdust, its windows glowing warmly with lamplight as families arrived to celebrate the occasion. Edmund stood near the entrance, greeting villagers personally, a habit he had cultivated steadily over the past year, determined to know the people he governed rather than simply ruling over them from a comfortable distance. Lanterns hung along the schoolhouse fence, and someone had strung ribbons of cheerful color across the doorway, a small festive touch that felt fitting for an occasion so many in the village had never expected to witness during their lifetimes. Children darted between the gathered adults, pointing excitedly at the new desks visible through the windows, already imagining themselves seated among the other students come morning. Vincent Hale arrived with his own family in tow, his young daughter clutching his hand tightly, eyes wide with excitement at the prospect of attending the very school where she would soon begin her own lessons. He caught Clara's eye across the gathering crowd and offered a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the long journey they had all traveled together to reach this peaceful evening. Eliza Combe had closed her inn early for the occasion, bringing trays of fresh bread and warm cider to share among the gathered villagers, her earlier guilt long since transformed into genuine friendship with the woman she had once been too frightened to defend. As the evening celebration continued, Margaret approached Clara quietly, drawing her aside from the main gathering. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Margaret said, "about something I have been considering for some time now." Clara studied her friend's thoughtful expression with curiosity. "Of course, Margaret. What is on your mind?" "I have been reflecting on everything that happened over the past year," Margaret said. "The pain of discovering my husband's past, certainly, but also the strength it took for you to return to Ashfield, to demand truth from a man who held such power over your life. I wish to establish a fund, separate from the general restitution efforts, meant specifically to support women in this village who find themselves in difficult circumstances, whether through no fault of their own, or through choices society judges too harshly. I would like to name it after you, if you are willing." Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly at the unexpected honor. "Margaret, that is generous beyond anything I could have imagined. Of course I would be honored." The two women embraced warmly, a bond forged through hardship now solidified through genuine friendship and shared purpose, a friendship neither could have predicted on that tense afternoon a year earlier when Clara had first returned to a village that once cast her out. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and villagers began making their way home beneath a sky full of stars, Clara walked slowly back toward her cottage, Nathaniel accompanying her along the familiar path. "It is strange," Clara said softly, "to think how different everything might have turned out, if you had never found me, if we had never decided to return here together. I think, in some way, we were always meant to find our way back," Nathaniel replied. "My mother carried her truth for over 20 years, waiting for the right moment to release it into the world. Perhaps that moment simply required both of us, working together, to finally bring it fully into the light." Clara smiled at the thought, pausing at the edge of her garden to look back toward the village, its lights glowing warmly in the darkness, no longer a place of painful memory alone, but a home slowly rebuilding itself into something better than it had been before. "Whatever brought us here," Clara said, "I am grateful for it. Grateful for you, Nathaniel, and for the strange, difficult, beautiful path that led us both home." Nathaniel nodded, watching the village lights flicker gently in the cool autumn evening. "As am I, Clara, as am I." And as the stars deepened overhead and the last sounds of celebration faded into peaceful quiet, Ashfield settled into a night unlike any it had known in a generation. A village finally at peace with its own truth, ready to face whatever future awaited it. Together, and without the burden of buried secrets weighing down its path forward. In the months and years that followed, the story of Clara's return became something of a quiet legend throughout the surrounding countryside, told not as a tale of scandal or ruin, but as a story of courage rewarded, of truth finally allowed to breathe after decades of suffocating silence. Parents in Ashfield would tell their children about the seamstress who returned to face a duke, and the young man who carried his mother's letter across half the country to find the answers he deserved. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was finished and the cottage grew warm with the glow of the hearth, Clara would sometimes sit by her window, needle in hand, and think of how far the road had carried her, from the frightened girl forced out into darkness, to the woman who had finally found her way home, not merely to a village, but to a life rebuilt on honesty rather than fear.